insect illustration. He learned insect illustration on the job in 1975 as a research assistant at the University of Queensland. And he's worked at the Queensland Museum since 1982, 30 years in entomology, and since 2012 as a collection imager, specialising in focus-stacked deep focus photography and digital editing. His illustrations have appeared and photographs have appeared in many books, journals, posters, displays, and websites. Geoff was a Smithsonian Fellow in 2005. He was the president of the Etymological Society of Queensland in 2012 and was chair of the organising committee of the US-based Guild of Natural Science Illustrators annual conference and exhibit in Brisbane in 2019, which was wonderful, and we had the visitors come to the Fryer Library to have a look at our books. In 2018, a selection of Geoff's photographs were printed in 3 metres across at the Queensland Museum, and some were projected onto our William Jolly Bridge. Queensland Museum's current exhibition, Insect Agency, features 100 images produced by Geoff and colleague Lily Kump. Many of these images are collaborative efforts in both photography and digital imaging, and my son and I greatly enjoyed Insect Agency on the last day of the school holidays, Geoff has been etching since 1998, most of the time in the Studio West End here in Brisbane, and he helps with their summer workshops. His 1-hour talk, and I think I put it in the chat, I hope people can see it, called A Scientific Illustration, was held in 2021 at the World Science Festival in Brisbane, and it's had over 10,000 views. No doubt after the talk today, you'll want to have a look at that talk as well. So without further ado, I might just also say the hero image for our conference was, I thought, Miriam Sibylla Miriam's illustration of the transformation of caterpillars into butterflies, and that was chosen as the hero image of our conference. In fact, it's by a chap named Donovan, as Geoff has discovered from a later work of the 18th century, and that plate was tipped into our copy of the Miriam work. It's too late, bearing in mind the previous session about fixity and dynamism. Too late for our treasures book, which says it's by Miriam. But with that, I'll hand over to Geoff.
Thanks, Simon. I'll just share my screen. And everybody can see that, I hope. Okay, so I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their continued connection to country, including water and culture of the land where I have the privilege to work and live. So I started off on a Taringa State School, skillfully sited on a traffic island and no longer there. And I started drawing because I had a great teacher in grade 6, and he got us copying from the old social studies book 2D to 2D, which was easier. And I developed a passion for drawing. I used to draw dogs a lot and landscapes and buildings, things. I wasn't very good at people. And our house had a love of books, and my grandmother's too. There are some of my grandmother's books on the left. We pored over that Everest 1933. I used to escape to my grandmother's from not that great a happier household. But both my grandmother, whose potter's down the bottom, and my mother were potters. So there was a lot of interest in art and craft in the house. And I did a science project in grade 8 going into grade 9. And my godfather worked at CSIRO at Long Pocket. And he said, do something simple, something like the cabbage butterfly. So I did the cabbage butterfly. And I looked at the life cycle of it. My mum had ornamental kale growing in the garden. Nobody ate the stuff back then. And I was able to breed these cabbage butterflies. And the drawing on the left from my project was done down a microscope I had at home, and it's probably the first drawing I ever did down a microscope. And my prize was a book. I started work with the late, great Tom Woodward at University of Queensland as a research assistant. I dropped out of uni and at James Cook. And it was Whitlam years and there was money around and I got a job there. I was very lucky to get it still. There was a lot of competition. And he sent me off to Sybil. She was Sybil Monteith then, now back to her maiden name of Sybil Curtis. And she gave me 2 one-hour lessons and drawing on scraper board. And then I started work after a hiatus of doing a course and things. I started work at the old Queensland Museum in 1982, working for Geoff Monteith as an insect technician and illustrator. Geoff is one of the great collectors. He's nearly 82 now, and not so well, but he's still collecting. And he took me in the field, first to Coombe Tops, and my first North Queensland trip with Geoff to the Daintree in 1982. So I wasn't just a technician. We had to do field work and we had to climb those mountains in the background with big packs on our back. And that's the ridge of Mount Sorrow, windswept, behind Cape Tribulation. We went up that mountain at least 3 times that week. And at the top, it was a wonderland into the Valley of the Roaring Meg. And those are gymnostoma, which is called the Daintree pine. It's sold in nurseries. I have one growing in the backyard. It's a living fossil and looked like a Japanese garden to me then. And we did lots of amazing walks. A lot of hardship, a lot of leeches, a lot of scratches, stinging trees and all that, and lots of rain and wet boots, but an incredible experience. We walked right round the back of Mossman Gorge once on a 5-day walk, although I had Giardia, which made it less than pleasant. And we were looking for these special high mountain insects like this one, which is a moss bug, a pelorodiad. That's the southern species, but we found them up north too. And the Queensland Museum collection, it's now about 4 million specimens. And at the peak of our collecting with Geoff, it was, we were sucking in 30,000 specimens labelled and mounted each year. Those are tiny beetles and other things glued to the ends of those little bits of card. And I had the job mostly of cutting up all those labels from 80 printed copies with scissors. It was a huge job. I introduced acid-free paper for labels and for the point cards because I was an artist and knew about such things. So to draw these things, a lot of those would have been new species. Only a quarter of Australia's insects are named still, and there were many new species being named. And I was taught a traditional scraper board technique. I used a stereo microscope with a camera lucidator attachment, a system of prisms, a mirror and lenses. So the mirror was silvered on the outside. You can see the specimen with the light on it under the microscope, and I'm drawing on a piece of paper. You adjust the light on your specimen against the light on the paper. And when you get them balanced enough and you engage the camera lucidator, you can see a shadowy image of your own hand and your pen, and you trace it. You're not allowed to draw it freehand because it had to be measurably accurate because many of these were new species. And that's what that specimen looked like that I was drawing there. Looked like underneath the microscope. That's just a photograph taken with a digital camera down the eyepiece of the microscope. And we couldn't take pictures of things that small with enough detail back then because of the depth of field problem. So we did a rough pencil outline and refined it to compensate for viewing angles and to distortions. The animals often die a bit twisted and you have to move them around to get something decent. Then use the old map technique from state school, transferring the pencil onto the sprayed kaolin surface of the scraper board. Americans call it scratch board. And then you ink it in with a Rotring pen, which used to clog a lot back then because of the clay. Then you map out the dark areas, and that's what I was doing under the microscope picture. And you paint them with thin layers of Rotring ink, let it dry, and then you stipple with a pen, lots of dots. And this is how I stipple. I asked Sybil how she stippled, and she said she stipples in patterns of 5, 4 dots with a dot in the middle. This is not my best stippling, but it gives you the idea. So you blot around the edge of the painted area, and then you increase the size of that mental box of 4 to evenly space the stipples so they don't cause a blot when it's photographically reduced for reproduction. Then you have a special little scraping tool that you scrape reverse stipples, and everywhere you scrape the painted black surface, you get a white dot, or looks like a white triangle there. And you'll see once I finished doing that, the little bits of scraper board that have come away, you blow away, you can see that. And this is stippling a segment of an antenna, which is a lighter thing, just to show you how lighter stippling was done. People who've seen my online talk for World Science Festival will recognize these videos, but they do show what's needed. So you generally have the light coming from the top left-hand side of the page, and that helps with mentally shading when you need to. And you can just see a few dots can cover quite a big area when the shading is fading away. That's probably enough of that. So then you scrape the dark areas, as I demonstrated, and draw in the hairs. And that's the finished drawing. That was a weird darkling beetle from New Caledonia that I drew for Eric Matthews. And it's called Pseudohelia because it looks like one of our pie dish beetles. And this is a primitive animation done with photocopies at the time to show you the process. It jumps around a bit, but it gives you the idea of what was done to produce that image. That's the finished image. And I illustrated by hand on scraper board till about 2004. Now, if you look at these two illustrations, the next picture is of actual beetles. So you can see the difference in illustration, but considering that the illustrations might take a week or more, and these images take an hour or so, you can't compete. Here's some darker examples. That's a darkling beetle also done for Eric Matthews. And that's a winged magnetic termite done for a big sign in Kakadu. So it was one of the biggest ones I ever did. And you can see all those dots are put on with a pen. And I did some watercolor at home. There was never the time or need to do color at work for me. This is a commission. It was a memorial to Frederick Athol Perkins, the first head of the entomology department, which now no longer exists at UQ, University of Queensland. This was all done with a brush. And you can see the detail there, all done with a sable hair brush. And each of those white lines had to be put on several times because the white paint on top of the darker paint would soak into the paper. I've been a printmaker since 1998, and I learned from Wim de Vos, who was my mentor until he died some years ago. And that involved drawing on a metal plate and by scraping through a ground, which is a resistant layer of bitumen and waxes. And that's my press, which Vim advised me, and I had a new bed made, and it was one of the best investments I've ever made. It lives in the studio West End. That's the first state etching based on a painting I did of a bright cornelian butterfly, deuterix, and the metal is removed by acid. And I then applied an aquatint, which very carefully, and did a coloured version from 2 plates, printed in 3 colours from 2 plates. And I created little masks made out of drafting film so that I could not pollute the red areas of the wings with the sepia. And you roll it through the press with blankets on top, and the blankets transfer the pressure through the wet paper and the wet paper goes down into the grooves of the plate, and that gives you your image. And that's the plate, the print being pulled, as we say, from the detailed plate, and that's the finished image. I must have been nuts. That was the first big etching I did, about A4 size, and I spent a lot of time on it. It's very ambitious for somebody with limited experience of the technique. And these are some more recent prints. The one on the left was a happy accident where the acid was stronger than we realized because of bad labeling by somebody who shan't be named and can't be answered to it. And the one on the right is a nice little aquatint and stipple combination. So I like to do more modern things now. But the experience with printmaking really informed my appreciation for the wonderful old prints in the museum library. That picture on the left was the corridor down to our room in the process of having the library being moved out. That's why all those blank shelves. But I used to walk past there, and there were these fantastic hand-coloured 19th century books right outside the room. And we have many journals back to volume 1. You can see the Transactions of the Linnaean Society back to volume 1 in 1791. And our oldest book is by Rondelet. It's from 1554, published in France, and it's a treatise on sea creatures. I love the orca, it's just lovely. But the artist probably never even saw an orca and was working from descriptions. But when they had a crab in front of them, they produced something quite accurate. This is by Swammerdam. It's a 1758 reprint of work done in the 1600s, a bit like Marion. It's an English translation, and these are nice big engravings. And he did lots of illustration of dissections of insects and other creatures. This is Kramer. I think it's one of 2 copies in Australia. It once belonged to Miskin. And these are the frontispieces, which are lovely. It's a 5-volume work, 1779 to 1782. And it took me ages to find that second frontispiece, which is really special. But it's in the 5-volume work. Every 3rd or 4th page after the introduction is a hand-coloured engraving of butterflies and moths. Beautiful work. We also have the only deluxe copy of Drew Drury's Insects in Australia. And that's a famous illustration of a Goliath beetle by Moses Harris, which the text says was found floating in the River Gaboon near the equatorial line by a lieutenant on His Majesty's ship Renown. I gather that Drury paid £100 for it, or £10 for it, that's right, which was a huge sum back then, but nothing more was found of it for a long time, so he got a bargain. And Drury gave money or provided materials for Lewin plates and things, and Lewin came out to New South Wales and he produced this lovely work on transformations of moths, mostly in the first edition in 1805 and the second edition 1822, although we think ours might be a little earlier. It's a transitional copy of the second edition, and those are the first etchings done on the continent of Australia. This is another favourite work. As you can see, I tend to lean towards the insects, but this is the atlas from a 13-volume work by Lacordaire. And I think there's 134 plates in it, and they're all stipple engraved, which the French excelled at. And you can see the stipples there. Probably the stipples are done with little wheels and things. But each whole beetle has been sometimes dolly wiped, like that brown beetle, where they've got brown ink and used. They call it à la poupée, as in from the doll, which is a dolly little bit of cloth that is used to wipe coloured ink into just one portion of the plate. And then each beetle has been hand coloured with watercolour and varnished over the top. They're incredible. And they're all done at life size. This is work by two of my heroines of scientific illustration, the Scott sisters. And this is the Joseph's coat moth on the right. We have a nice hand-coloured copy. Don't think it's quite complete, of their father's work on Lepidoptera, and it was published in 1864. There is a second edition, a second volume, which I think is from the 1870s. Can't remember exactly when, but it's not as fine. And you can see the close-up of the Joseph coat moths on native grapevine there, and they just were fantastic. This isn't from the library. This is something I was given by the late Dr. Pat Marks, and that's an old copy of that plate, but this is Creff's Snakes of Australia. And I photographed this one the other day. It's a diamond python or a carpet python, and you can just see they were so good at drawing from life. They actually looked at the living animal and produced beautiful work. Another great hero of mine is Edward Lear, who taught Gould to do lithography, and I believe Gould later expunged Lear's signature from some plates, which wasn't very nice. And these are toucans, which we have in the library, and he drew them from living birds in a ducal menagerie. There's just so much life in that toucan on the left. It's just lovely. We have all the Gould books in the museum library. They're not in the greatest condition, some of them, but and there's a telltale stamp all over them, sadly. Some of those I remove it with Photoshop later, but this is Richter and Gould in 1869. And we photographed all the finches for a Brisbane Festival event a couple of years ago, which they're rather nice, beautiful finches. There's the Queen Victoria's rifle bird. And we also, the library's rich in all sorts of things. These are chromolithographs by Ernst Haeckel, in the voyage of HMS Challenger, which was the voyage was in 1873 to 76, went around the world trawling deep sea animals and things, and it was the first vessel to do that. And this was published in 1882. And I found to my surprise there was a dissection of a thylacine in there, which was pretty amazing. And this is a chromolithograph from Bleecker, famous work on fishes. Bleecker was in the Dutch colony that's now Indonesia, and he painted all these wonderful tropical fish. Now, I should say that all these plates were photographed by me, and it may be of interest to some of you people that we have digitized 30,000 pages of Queensland Museum documents using a superseded lift and camera and an extra seat of Capture One. And Capture One, if you take a picture of a grey card, a big enough grey card under the lighting that you've got, you can apply a lens cast calibration, which evens out the light as if you've got professional lighting. And we did that all with volunteer labour. This is what Simon was talking about. That's the Donovan that's been bound with the Marion in the Fryer copy. And one of my colleagues in one of the groups on Facebook pointed out that that's Marion's version of the same moth. And then I found that the third image from the left is from the first edition of Marion, and the one on the right is the Fryer version. So you've definitely got Marion, it's just that somebody's bound Donovan in as well. So I went to America for 3 months on a Queensland Smithsonian Fellowship in 2005. And I also looked at various US imaging systems. And I learned to illustrate from scratch in Illustrator and Photoshop with a mouse. And this is an animation of probably 3 weeks of work drawing this little bug. But this was done after I got back. And that's to show the detail in it. And I only ever did one of those after I got back, but the training in Photoshop and how to illustrate in it has just revolutionized the way I work. So now I take focus stack photographs. This is a special robber fly that was described by Greg Daniels only a couple of years ago and named after my colleague, Chris Burwell. It's a really special one. Those eyes are like big discs, flat almost from the top, thin, but they look like they're rounded, but they're not as rounded as they look. And this is our visionary digital system built by Roy Larimer in the States. And then we got a new beast of a computer a year or so ago. And it has 64 cores and a 3090 and lots of other powerful things. And we need that because we need to process hundreds and hundreds of images sometimes. So this is the 50 megapixel Canon we've had for a few years. It's now been superseded to some extent, but they've got rid of that MPE lens, sadly, and there's been no replacement. Canon is going to mirrorless, and there is loss of some things in the meantime. And that's the first image we got with just JPEGs from that first attempt at taking a picture of a fly. This is a yellow-faced blowfly. And you can see the detail that's in it from the 50 megapixel. And then after using a microscope tube, Roy came up with the idea of using an adapter on a 200 millimeter telephoto lens, wide open and set at infinity. And that filled the 50 megapixel sensor with no appreciable loss of quality. And you get that sort of resolution. You can see the grooves in that CETA, strong hair in the front that you couldn't see in the other version of the same species. This is a Christmas beetle from North Queensland. just showing the detail we can get, and zooming in with a 20 times Mitsutoyo objective. Tiny land snails, what we take, we can rival scanning electron microscope shots, and that is much less risk to these precious fragile shells, tiny things. When we still had just a 20 megapixel camera on that microscope I was mentioning, microscope tube, I sometimes had to take this is 4 shots of focus stacked images of portions and then merged into one bigger image to get enough megapixels. And this shows the detail that's in there. That shows that there's 2 different sorts of sensors, which the expert who came up for the day when we first got it just couldn't believe. He'd never seen the sensors in a photograph, let alone be able to tell there were 2 different sorts. But if some fossil images, that's a equisetum, a horsetail, which showed that they persisted for longer than was thought in Australia. That's a beetle wing cover or a elytrum on the right. And I photographed things in Cape York amber, which was only found in the last couple of decades. This is a parasitic wasp taken with the old system. And you can see that it's quite grainy and difficult, but this is what we can do with similar material from Cape York with the new system. Roy made me this wonderful little black velvet thing, which allowed me to photograph butterflies without having on a black background and other things, without having to deep etch. And so that's what you get out of the camera, basically. And you don't have to go around and try and cut out around every hair. The collection, as I said, we've got 4 million specimens. We have many types. I think there's about 10,000 primary types. So the types define the species for all time, and many of them are old. This is a Miskin butterfly type described by William Henry Miskin, who lived at the top of Miskin Street in Toowong, if people know it. And it's from the Dawson River and described in 1891, just before he ran off with the maid. And his first wife's father sold his collection and 200 wonderful books to the Queensland Museum for £226 in 1892. So this is another holotype, and just to show you what's needed, this guy in Belgium wanted to study this specimen, which was collected by Tom Woodward on top of Mount Timbergargan in 1959, and it's the only one of 2 known specimens, I think. And I had to take a total of 1,700 50 megapixel shots to make those 5 views, most of them that top left image of the snout that he needed. We had a Hasselblad H4DMS multi-shot camera, which was 200 megapixels, that came with, I got $226,000 from the federal government in 2011 for equipment, and we had to supply images for the Atlas of Living Australia. And one of the pieces of equipment we got was a Hasselblad designed to take whole draw images. And one of the first things I did was photograph some of the Dodd collection. And this is just to show you, this is a wonderful collection, that some of which is on display at the moment. The older part is 100 years old. Some of you may recognize this as the cover of Peter Carey's Collected Stories, which we supplied. And they were collected by the son, Alan Dodd, the man who saved us from prickly pear in 1927, 26, 27. And in his retirement, he went to New Guinea and collected these beautiful butterflies. He had a real flair for arranging them. This shows you the detail that's in that 200 megapixel shot. I've been working a bit with Colombian-born artist, Maria Fernanda Cardoso, who's got a worldwide reputation, and she had a career in the US and Colombia, and married in Australia and had to start all over again. And I first met her in 2012, and she was producing this Museum of Copulatory Organs in the Sydney Biennale in 2012. And she used one of my drawings that I'd done for Jerry Cassis down in University of New South Wales of true bug genitalia, mirrored genitalia. We entomologists spend a lot of time looking at genitalia to work out different species. And those genitalia 3D prints from 3D models of Papillion harvestman genitalia. It was a fantastic exhibition. And she got interested, she's interested in animal reproduction and sex. And she got interested in peacock spiders, which are native to Australia, only found in Australia. And the males dance like peacocks for the females. And when they die, the flaps that they spread when they're dancing are wound tightly around the abdomen. And my volunteer at the time, Andy Wang, was able to tease them away from the abdomen and produce these rather abstract-looking images. We also did front-on views by propping up the little tiny spiders. They're about 3 or 4 millimeters long, so quite tiny things. And we would prop them up with pins or spread the abdomens with pins and then mostly Photoshop them out like that. I would do that. But Maria Fernanda liked the effect of the pins on the abdomens. And she did these 2 works, and they were sold jointly to London's Tate Gallery and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, and also exhibited in the US, printed really big. And she got a established fellowship, and that gave her money in 2020 to photograph some more. And you can see why this one, all the peacock spiders are in the genus Maratus. And you can see why this one's called Elephants if you look. And you can see the detail. These images took about 1,000 images to make, 2 lots of 500 stacks. And the anatomy of the thing is pretty amazing. So we take those source images, and I'll explain more about that later, but this is a stack of 434 source images of the face of Maratus cristatus. And I've got this, some of you have seen my online presentation, will have seen this before, but it's a very good illustration. So on the left, we have the source images, and the composite image is building on the right. This is speeded up, but it really shows you the magic of focus stacking. We just couldn't take these photos even 10 years ago, 5 years ago to some of them. Excuse me, just need a bit of water. So this is Maratus pavonus, and just to show you what we did, we would take 2 focus stacked images and merge them to produce that image. And that one suffered some damage in the spreading process, and we tried to spread another one by squeezing, but it only spread one side. But I was able to use sections of that one to repair the final image. And I also was able to repair the background card to get rid of the pin in the background and the gap. So that's before on the left and after on the right. Like I said, the Photoshop skills I learned have been invaluable. That's a close-up to show you how clean the cutout is. And she had them printed big, and some of them were sold overseas. And it's now going to be a touring exhibition next year, which would be exciting. As I said, we had some of my images printed really big on a hoarding to cover construction at the Queensland Museum. It was really amazing to see them that big. And that same year, they printed this section as for Ipswich branch of the Queensland Museum, the Workshops Rail Museum. And that was great to see. And they also projected them on the bridge. So in 2019, after the GNSI conference, I was invited to present at one of Les's Daintree workshops. I've been to a second one since. And the training I got there when I wasn't actually presenting was fantastic. And he recommended things like these new AI Topaz programs for upsizing and sharpening, which made things like this unique photograph of emerging giant wood moth larvae, first instar larvae, publishable, which wouldn't have been publishable in the past. And so I reprocessed some of the old images with this software. I don't know whether you'll be able to see on your screens, but this is before, and that's after I have adjusted and sharpened it with both Topaz and Les's amazing actions in Photoshop. So the Insect Agency exhibition, which is on now, we had to take a lot of new images for it. That's a nice little face of a mole cricket, rather cute. And Chris Burwell carefully selected each specimen. And that specimen on the right is one of the few that we weren't actually able to display the actual specimen that I photographed. That's in fact the holotype of what is probably the smallest bee in the world. It has a rival in North America, but hasn't really been worked out. And it took Chris all day to find another specimen in the collection that we could display. This is Lily Compe, I call her my apprentice sometimes. She's been learning from me. She started off as a volunteer, and we set her up with the old lift, which is what we were using to digitize those documents. And we got a new computer and borrowed my other ISO screen, and she was able to produce lots of the images of the larger things with that coarser lift. So she'd often do the whole insect image and I'd do the detailed image. Now this is the smallest thing we photographed. It's a very economically important egg parasite that gets bred up and spread through crops to wipe out Helicoverpa, which is one of the main moth pests in Australia, before they even hatch without insecticides. You can see how tiny it is, and it's on display there, but you have to basically take a photograph with your phone on macro to see the little tiny dot glued to the end of the piece of card. We decided to use a black background wherever possible, because I knew that it would be very difficult to produce white backgrounds which would be consistent, or even grey backgrounds consistent. So that's what we did, and that's a water beetle showing its amazing superpower of having eyes above and below the waterline where it would swim. And Lily and I collaborated on quite a lot of images. That's the images that came out of the stacking program. I did paint the pins black with rotring ink to stop the flare that we get from pins, which are stainless steel. And there's a dark reflection in the thorax or pronotum on the left. And I've flipped the wing cover and adjusted it and to produce that final edit. And I painted even micro pins black, and that's the effect you get. With a bit of adjustment and careful pasting in of missing bits. So focus stacking, which I've been talking about, allows us to photograph small insects clearly. So But when we take high magnification images like this dragonfly eye, it can sometimes take 500 or more images, each of them 50 megapixels, and each of them converted into 16-bit TIFFs become 288 megabytes. So it's a lot of data crunching for that big computer to do. So source images are just equal interval images taken with overlapping focus from the top of focus to the bottom of focus. So the top of focus is the top of the pin on the left, and the bottom of focus is the bottom of the claws on the right. And this is after that being focus stacked like we did with the spider face, but with much fewer images. This is the editing process. And sadly, since I'd last photographed it with the Hasselblad, I had learned a lot more about lighting, get a much better lit example, but somehow the front tarsal claw of the front right foot had been lost since I'd photographed the first time. So I had to copy across the claw from the old version and merge it in and get rid of various damages that were due to a bird that this specimen had been rescued from on an ANZ's expedition back in the 90s on the Mossman Gorge. So this shows you the detail of these 50 megapixel stacked images. Another problem we have is we sometimes get these funny print throughs from the algorithm, excuse me, of the focus stacking program. Gets confused when something is in sharp focus behind a structure that's in sharp focus in the foreground. And you can see on the edge of the antenna going over that bright edge of the yellow fuzz of this carpenter bee that there's a sort of a print through effect. So you choose all the images where the background is out of focus and the bit you want is in focus, and you do a substack and then you brush it in by hand within the stacking program. Another thing is flare and dirt and stuff like that. So in this, that's the images that came out of the stacking program, and I found I had a trick in Photoshop that I developed using the color replace brush in luminosity mode, blending mode. I was able to go between hairs without losing them and convert it to black, the background back to black, and then carefully repair bits where there's dirt, like on that lower lobe of the leg. We used diffusion and reflection to get the best lighting for each specimen. And the Mitsutoyo objective that we bought for the exhibition more than doubled, 50 times more than doubled the magnification of this of the system for the cost of a fraction of the system. And this is a living giant mosquito in our backyard. They're good mosquitoes. Their larvae eat other mosquito wrigglers, and the adults, both male and female, males never bite humans or mosquitoes, never bite humans, but that's the feathery antennae shows it's a male because it's got those to find females from pheromones. But the females don't bite either because the larvae, because she's got the protein she needs to make eggs from the other larvae she ate as a wriggler herself. So that's a freshly emerged specimen that I pinned underneath, not fully through the thorax, and photographed on a black background. And I just want to show you, zooming in, can you see those, that fringe of scales around the eye? This is the first decent image I took with the 50 times. And it's astounding to me, even. It just blew my mind when I first saw it, and the detail in it round these scales and hairs round the eye. The scales are amazing in detail. And the eye, these columnar, flattened top columnar ommatidia, these segments of the eye just boggle the mind. Now, this is the abdomen taken at 5 times with the Mitsutōyu. If you look at these two sections, that's the lower section. And this one was the biggest stack I've ever done, 827 50 megapixel source images to make that one image. And I edited out the grey for the display's black background. And each one of those scales is only 0.1 of a millimeter long. So this is the black velvet thing that Roy Larimer, who built the system, made specially for me. He's been very generous. Sadly, he's now retired. And he made this thing where he glued black velvet to a metal plate. There's a little screw thing that I can screw this column into in the center of it. And he reamed out a reservoir in the top of that little column for wax or plasticine. So you can pin the butterfly in, and that's how you get that wonderful black background. This is a North Queensland zodiac moth that some of you may have seen in Cairns Botanic Gardens. They're quite common there. And that's with the 5 times Mitsutōyu. That's a crop to show the detail in that image. And this is to show you all the garbage I had to clean up in Photoshop to get that nice image. So there's lots of work in a lot of these images. And that's the 50 times of some of those scales. This is the Vilio Ulysses butterfly that we used a lot in the display. And this is zooming in at 5 times. That's at 20 times with the old maximum power. And this is with the newer maximum power at 50 times. And that structure in the black scales has been used, it was featured in the display because it's been an inspiration for black paints and things. And the external graphic artist designing the display said, can we have a close-up of this bit? So 2 101 image stacks and lots of editing, and a whole day later, I produced that, but it was worth it. And you can see that's as they were setting up the display, and each of those scales has been printed about 30 centimeters long, a foot long to me in the old money. And each one is actually 0.1 of a millimeter long. So it's quite amazing. And I had the easier job than poor Susan, who had to put in all those specimens. Those are actual insects, and some of those insects are about 15 to 20 centimeters long, big insects. It's all of them leading you into the exhibition. And that's how the Ulysses and some of the other images are used in the display. And you can see that scanning electron microscope of the structure of that black scale down the bottom right of the Ulysses one. Not all the good images made the cut. The native stingless bee, this is one of my favorites, but they used a lateral side view instead. And we produced a slide screen show with some of the stacked images and images taken by Chris Burwell and myself on our own cameras in our own time. And Chris is an excellent photographer and really interested in dragonflies and damselflies. It's a beautiful blue damselfly, the southwestern billabong fly is its common name, and just a superb image. And this is one of the images I took on museum time with my own camera up in the Daintree. It's a couple of green tree ants, and they're on a smilax vine, which has provided a nectary to attract the ants so that it gets protected from other insects eating it. And this is a special insect that once fell into a late friend of mine's beer when he, in the Surface Paradise beer garden. This is another specimen. And Tom Woodward rang him up at 9 o'clock at night and said, "Where'd you get that bug?" Because they hadn't seen it for 100 years. And Doug Cook found it on his property in the Tellabudra Valley later on Milotis discolor. And you can see that it looks like it was taken yesterday, but it's in fact a photograph taken by Geoff Wright on 35mm slide. I still draw and even make books under Adele Outridge's tutelage, and I've been drawing in this little book for nearly 2 years. And I get things that in the studio that Adele has collected and spend ages drawing them. And the studio is an artistic sanctuary where I can learn, create, and teach with good mates, and we play old rock and roll and drink red wine on Tuesday nights and have a great time. That's Adele on the left, demonstrating folding, and that's my colleague Imelda, who's curator of the Pacific collection at the Queensland Museum, and she's come along and gets a lot out of creating on a Tuesday night. That's it, and those are all the people I need to thank.
Wow, Geoff, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And it's just fascinating how these scientific technological developments have affected your career since 1982. I just had a question, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. With regard to those great illustrators of the natural world of the 18th century, like Redoute and others, and you showed a picture of the books that are still in the museum, like the Transactions of the Linnaean Society. To what extent do their work back then inform your work as a scientific artist? And do you still refer to those books?
I've always had an interest in them, so I still refer to them. But they produced they had conventions that we still follow, like the light always comes from the top left of the page, and they were using camera lucidus and things on different ones to what we use, but they were doing accurate drawings and things. A lot of what we can do now is, well, even when I started, what we could do, we could make better images, but a lot of those images are incredibly accurate for their time. Some aren't. There are some really bad ones that have survived, but some are very accurate. I know that John Lawrence used those images from the Lacordaire as illustrations for a CD-ROM he did in the 90s because they stood up to being enlarged, and they were very accurate for what he was trying to show.
Yeah, they're still amazing, aren't they?
Yeah.
Paul Leggett has written into the comments, are you trying to capture an ideal version of the insect, or one that is pleasing to the eye, that corresponds to our powers of curiosity?
Yeah, well, we were always taught when I was drawing to take an average view, to look at a number of specimens. And I came a cropper with one of those because I was drawing Boegus weevil, one that was used for controlling water hyacinth. People think that water hyacinth just disappeared, but it didn't. It was a biological control program that with this little weevil. And I was given a series to draw from, and the taxonomist was back in America, and he was saying, that's not there. And the local guy was there, and I showed him it down the microscope. Yes, it's there. So we put it in. It turned out they'd mixed up a number of species in that series, so that was why it wasn't right. So, but generally, when you're drawing, you try and get a representative, idealized version. But with photographs, of course, you're only photographing one specimen. But I tend to make them more attractive. I edit out the pins and things and clean them up with Photoshop to get rid of all the dust and stuff that even when you try a lot of cleaning, it's almost impossible to get rid of.
Well, Geoff, well, I have another question here from Fiona McConnell. Have you worked with any of the animation studios or immersive exhibition designers to develop their art?
No, I haven't. I did a very primitive animation way back, although we have supplied images for the games that are in the display. You know, I'm sure your little boy would have enjoyed the Build-A-Bug thing, but we provided photographs for them to have representative different bits of insects and that sort of thing. And we have supplied images for some people who've come and asked for artistic things. We get lots of artists visiting the collection too. It's been my privilege to get to know Fiona Hall, and she was working with us quite a bit, and there's quite a few other artists who come in and use the collection.
Neil James has written, is there still a role for drawing in scientific illustration given the quality of focus stacked photography, or is it increasingly moving to an artistic pursuit?
It's increasingly moving to an artistic pursuit. I hardly ever draw at work. You just can't compete, you know. Take an hour to even, well, what you do is you take several photographs, which still might take a whole day to take those several photographs to show everything the taxonomist needs to show. But, you know, you'd be drawing it for a whole week to get a similar result, and you just can't compete. The mite people still draw, though. They haven't quite given up, so they because their specimens are so tiny, and they haven't really gone across to the photographic way of doing things.
I had the honour of visiting the studio with yourself and Adele and the others a few weeks ago, and it's wonderful to see that the beauty of people immersing themselves in these pursuits of engraving and printing and bookmaking and so on. So, look, Geoff, it's just been wonderful to hear about you and your career that's spanned such a long period of time. Fascinating for all of us. Looking in the comments, there are a lot of people saying, what an amazing presentation, absolutely beautiful, sublime, fantastic talk. So you've really honoured us today, and thank you very much for that.